And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and other places as well. My guest for this show, a repeat guest and a dear friend, is Thom Hartmann. He's a progressive national and internationally syndicated talk show host, described by Talkers Magazine as America's most important progressive host and one of the top 10 radio shows in the country every year for over a decade. He's also a New York Times best-selling author of dozens of books. His website is thomhartmann.com, any way you spell it. His newest book is The Hidden History of Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. So great to have you back, Thom.
Thanks, Rob. It's always great hanging out with you here.
Yeah.
I appreciate the invite.
So let's start with the definition of oligarchy.
Well, the last book that you and I talked about that came out 6 months ago, The Hidden History of American Monopoly. Monopoly is where a small group of corporations or individuals acquire control of individual sectors of the marketplace to the extent that they can prevent competition. And oligarchy is the political equivalent of that. It's where a small group of people, typically very wealthy individuals, seize control, although it can be corporations as well, with front people, seize control of the political process in a way that blocks out competition, what you and I would normally refer to as democracy. And oligarchy, and the big problem with oligarchy, and I lay this out in the book in some detail, is that because it is essentially an unpopular form of governance, when it arises in a democracy, which is where it usually happens in our era, what the signal that an oligarchy is happening, the single most specific thing you can point to that says, oh, we're now in an oligarchy instead of a democratic republic, is when the government ceases to pass laws and behave in a way that defends the vast majority of the people, the demos of democracy, the people, and instead acts and passes legislation and has economic policies that exclusively benefit the oligarchs, the top 1%, essentially, or the top, in the United States' case, the top 1/10 of 1%. And according to a study that Gillens and Page did that was published back in 2014, prior to the Reagan Revolution in 1981, before 1981, we were a functioning democratic republic because what the people wanted got translated into public policy with regularity. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, unemployment, long-term unemployment benefits, the minimum wage and the minimum wage steadily rising, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There's this, food stamps, Section 8 housing, Pell Grants for students to go to college. I mean, the list, there's literally hundreds of things on that list that were passed into law between basically 1933 and 1980 that were all reflecting the will of the American electorate. And if you did public opinion polling back then, and they did, and you looked then at what passed through Congress, you found that there was a lot of consistency between those two things. Post-Reagan presidency, since basically 92, since the end of the Reagan-Bush era, what we have seen is a complete disconnect. It started out as a gradual disconnect in the 90s with Clinton pushing through policies that were very unpopular, like NAFTA and GATT, creating the WTO, and allowing giant media companies to combine and weakening our anti-monopoly laws, et cetera, saying the era of welfare is over. But let me just finish this point. The critical thing is that since the Reagan Revolution, what legislatures are doing no longer reflects what the people want. That produces discontent among the people. The people start getting really pissed off. They don't know why, but they know something's wrong. And it opens a space for a demagogue. Oligarchies rarely last longer than a single generation, 20 years. They always go one of two directions, either back to democracy, which happened here in the 1860s and happened here in the 1930s, or they go into police state tyranny, which has happened now in our lifetimes, in Hungary, in Russia, it's happening in Poland, in the Philippines, in Brazil, where we're seeing this over and over and over again, where these countries are flipping into police state tyranny. And that was the direction Donald Trump was taking us. And that's why this is such an important issue.
Well, the thing I wanted to point out was what a lot of the stuff you just described that moved us towards oligarchy were done by Democrats.
They were done with Democratic complicity. There was this period in the 70s as the modern oligarchs were consolidating power based on the formula that Lewis Powell put forward in 71. And then the Supreme Court that Lewis Powell got put on by Nixon in 72 had two decisions, in 76, Buckley, and in 78, Bellotti, where for the first time in the history of the United States, the Supreme Court said, when a politician is wholly owned by a single billionaire or a single corporation and behaves largely exclusively to the benefit of those people, we used to call that corruption, and we used to political corruption, and we used to call it bribery. We are no longer calling it either, because we're saying that the money that oligarch or that corporation is pouring into that politician, down that politician's throat, is not actually money, it's speech. And so it's protected by the First Amendment. That opened a tsunami of cash in 1979 and 1980 that Ronald Reagan rode that crest into the White House and has been sustaining the Republican Party ever since. Reagan came into office in 81, and he had two mandates. The first was to reduce the wealth of the middle class. And the story behind that is fascinating. We can get into that later. The second was to destroy the labor unions. And he did. I mean, he was very successful in destroying the labor unions, and as a consequence, in 1992, when Bill Clinton was running for president, in 76, 78, when the Supreme Court said big money in politics, no problem, the Republicans said, great, we'll take all you got. The Democrats said, we're not interested, because at that point in time, a third of America had a union job. And therefore, a third of American working people were subsidizing the Democratic Party through their union dues. And so the people were subsidizing the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was acting on behalf of the people. When Reagan took that from 30% down to 6%, well, it was actually around 8 or 10% when he left office. But during that 12-year period, when Reagan destroyed the unions, in furtherance of this goal that goes back to Russell Kirk, he defunded the Democratic Party, which was his second goal. And in defunding the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton found himself in a position where the only way he could successfully run for president was to do the same thing that Republicans were doing, which is go to big corporations for money. He and Al Fromm, when they reinvented the DLC in 1991, 92 to do this, said, well, we'll do it in an ethical way. We're only going to take money from those industries that are good, clean, white-collar industries that don't cause lots of pollution. We're not going to take money from steel or from coal or from natural gas or oil. We're going to take money from banks and insurance companies, because those are good, and pharmaceutical companies. These are good companies that everybody likes, and they're white collar jobs, and and this is the future, and tech companies. And this is the future of the internet and of America. And so we'll take that money. And so, from 92 until basically the end of the Obama presidency, the Democratic Party, the majority of the Democratic Party, and the two Democratic politicians we've had in that period of time were both massively indebted to these very large and powerful so-called white-collar industries. And as a result, they were dancing to the tune of their specific oligarchs as well. I see that changing rapidly. Bernie Sanders' 2 runs for president have really altered the dynamics of the Democratic Party to the point where now a little over a third of all the Democrats elected at the federal level are members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. If we can get to half plus 1, we can completely change the Democratic Party and make it a progressive party. And there's a lot of motion in that direction. There's a group that is in the process of flipping Michigan Democratic, for example. A lot of grassroots activity.
What happens if they to 1/2 plus 1? Get rid of Pelosi, put in.
I beg your pardon?
What would happen if they get to that 1/2 plus 1 that you just referred to? Will that mean that they can get rid of Pelosi, a corporate Democrat, and put in somebody who's progressive? How would it change?
It's not a matter of getting rid of Pelosi. I'm my guess, although she's going to leave at the end of next year. She's already said that she's not going to be Speaker of the House any longer. But what it is that you'll see the policies change, and you see this in states that have been taken over by progressives, where the state Democratic Party has been essentially taken over by progressives. You saw this in Vermont, for example, when the state legislature voted for a single payer healthcare system. And the governor, Peter Shumlin, tried to put it into place. He had formerly been the president of the Senate in Vermont. The only problem was the federal government said you may not use Medicare and Medicaid money, which, when a third of your state is on Medicare or Medicaid, and you can't use their money to fund your single payer healthcare system, because the federal government refused to issue a waiver. Both those programs allow waivers. It crippled Vermont's ability to do a single payer system, and they had to walk away from it, sadly.
And that was under Obama, right?
That was under Obama, yeah. And because the Obama presidency owed the insurance industry huge. I mean, that's why Obamacare was constructed to shovel hundreds of billions of dollars a year in extra profits into the insurance industry.
How about Biden? Where does he fit into this picture in terms of backing from corporations?
Well, this is the interesting thing. Large chunks of the Democratic Party still rely on these various large industries, and Biden has to keep that in mind. But he's made it fairly clear that he's going to be a one-term president, and that he's not going to be running for political office afterwards. He's going to be 80, when in his 80s when he leaves office in 4 years. And so I think that has freed him from a lot of his traditional constraints. The problem is the people that he's surrounding himself with. Many of them are really good progressives, and we saw during the primary campaign, we saw Kamala Harris move in a substantially more progressive direction than she ever had in her career. As politics shift, and they tend to shift rapidly, and they tend to shift every 40 or 50 years in the United States. We go back and forth in these 40 or 50 year cycles, these basically 2-generation cycles, where we repeat the mistakes of the last cycle, the 20s and the 80s, for example, and then those mistakes create a disaster. We go Republican. And we get the roaring 20s, or we get the roaring 80s and 90s, and then that creates a series of economic disasters typically, and we saw this in 2008, and we're seeing it again right now. And those disasters then cause people to flip back to traditional economics, to Franklin Roosevelt kind of economics, and Lyndon Johnson kind of economics. And so I'm still cautiously optimistic that the Biden presidency is going to be the most progressive presidency. So far, everything I've seen indicates that the most progressive presidency we've had since Lyndon Johnson. The question is whether he's going to have the political courage to do the things that have to be done, and whether Chuck Schumer is going to do that. Chuck Schumer is starting now to quake in his boots because he's afraid of being primaried by AOC. And so, it's getting real interesting now as progressives are seizing lots and lots of power in the Democratic Party.
You had a conversation with David Corton recently talking about the history of the American Revolution. So 2 things. One, you make clear in your book that the American Revolution wasn't the fight with the British. And 2, then you talk about who was involved in the revolution and the founding of the country. Could you get into that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the United States, and we talked about this to some extent 6 months ago on the book on oligarchy. What would
the book on monopoly?
Or monopoly, yeah, thank you. We fought a war against the British East India Company, essentially. They were calling the tune on all the economics in the colonies. The Crown was passing laws to benefit them. The Crown gave them monopolies on specific items like, fine clothing and instrumentation and watches. And I mean, there was a whole bunch of huge categories of commercial products that it was illegal to manufacture in the colonies. And the British, by the way, continued this policy right up until the 1950s. And that's why Gandhi, when India was a British colony, they were suffering under the exact same thing we were in 1776, only this was 1950s. And that's why Gandhi was using a spinning wheel as his logo. And that's why he went out and he gathered salt by the ocean side, because it was a crime to make your own clothing in India. It all had to be made in England so that, to provide good jobs for the loom weavers in largely in Manchester, and or Liverpool, I forget which, and so was refining salt. That was also against the law in India. So we fought a war against that, but it was also a war that we fought against oligarchy, because a kingdom is by definition a form of oligarchy. It's ruled by the rich. It's ruled by a small concentrated class or group of people. The only thing that uniquely identifies a kingdom from a normal oligarchy is DNA, is that there's this thread of DNA that runs through the senior leadership of the oligarchy. But it's still all around that thread. You have this collection of lords and ladies who are basically the holders of the wealth of the country, you know, the top 5% who control, you know, 80, 90% of all the wealth of the country. And that's what we fought the Revolutionary War against as well.
Well, in your book, you talk about how it was more of a mindset that was the revolution. And that's where I want you to go.
Well, the American Revolution was, for that, we have to back up a little bit. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes published a book called Leviathan. A Leviathan being something that's massive, right? A whale is a Leviathan. And his premise, he had two basic premises that he laid out in Leviathan that kicked off the Enlightenment. The first, then controversial one, was that people are essentially evil because we're all born from women, and the Bible tells us we're all born with original sin. Because of that, it's all women's fault, right? And that was the premise back then. And therefore, we do need what Hobbes referred to as the iron fist of church or state. We do need a Leviathan. We do need an overwhelming power to keep us from acting out our worst impulses. And in lacking that overwhelming power to constrain us, what will happen is we will revert back to the original state of humankind, which and during which life was nasty, brutish, and short. So that was his first point. His second point was, given all that, we still can govern ourselves. Now, this is a revolutionary concept for Hobbes to be laying out, particularly since he was the official court tutor for Charles I, and as a child. And that assertion, which was arguably an anti-monarchy assertion, kind of lit a fire that 25 years later in the 1670s, John Locke picked up on and took it a step further in his two treatises on government. He rejected Hobbes's notion that humans are evil and said, no, we can govern ourselves, and the evil people among us are the aberrations, not the norm. And he suggested that the purpose of government should be to establish the absolute right of individuals to their own lives, to life, to liberty, and to property. Now, keep in mind, in the 1600s, the King of England owned everything you own. Unless you were one of the top 10%, unless you were titled. Now they hadn't been exercising the right of the first night for a couple hundred years. Sleeping with a woman on the first night of her wedding, but that's, it goes all the way back to that kind of stuff. So Locke laid this out. Jefferson borrowed that phrase and changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because by 100 years later, 1776, personal property rights were no longer controversial. They were well established, at least for white men. And you also had Rousseau in this mix, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French anthropologist / philosopher, who around the time that Locke was writing, and in the decade after Locke was writing, now we're in the late 1600s, word is starting to come back to Europe from these explorations and expeditions that are going to North America, South and Central America, and Northern and Northwestern Africa. And what these explorers are finding is that these so-called savage tribes, these Aboriginal and indigenous people, actually have a pretty decent life. In most cases, they've done a fairly good job of governance. Yes, they may still use bows and arrows, but they live in peace. Ben Franklin highlighted this in 1787 when he brought 34 members of the Iroquois Confederacy to the opening day of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and said, and gave this little speech, and then said, actually wrote to a friend of his later, echoing it, that it would be an amazing thing. It's amazing. I forget the exact language, but words to the effect of, here we have 5 nations of ignorant savages, his phrase, he didn't mean it as a slur. Here we have 5 tribes of ignorant savages who have forged a bond of peace that has existed for 1,000 years. It would be an amazing thing if 13 colonies of educated Englishmen can't do the same. So this all informed the thinking of that generation, the 1770s generation of Enlightenment thinkers here in the United States, from slave owners like Jefferson to virulent opponents of slavery like Thomas Paine and John Adams. This whole collection of people, they all held this idea: yes, we can govern ourselves, and Locke and Rousseau were right, and Hobbes was wrong, at least about the natural state of man. And so, they'd really been struggling with that throughout the 1600s. I mean, this is where Calvinism came from. John Calvin's followers came out and said, well, if we're all born into sin and we're all evil, how do we figure out who among us is good enough to govern us? And the answer that the Calvinists came up with is, we look for God's blessing. And whoever God has blessed, obviously, those are the people we should pick to lead us. And of course, their criteria for God's blessing was wealth. And so that's why the Calvinists to this day, Betsy DeVos being one of the more famous examples, and her brother Eric Prince, these Calvinist billionaires out of Michigan, because the kind of Calvinist epicenter in the United States is Grand Rapids, Michigan. This idea that the rich should rule, which takes us back to oligarchy, there's still a huge element of that within the Republican Party, and and some within the Democratic Party as well. So anyhow, that's the background behind all this. And when Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, all that stuff was what was in his mind, as well as the opposition to the monopoly of the East India Company. And when you read the Bill of Particulars in the Declaration of Independence, that all becomes quite clear.
Well, what I really liked what you say in the book is that it wasn't the fight that was the revolution. It was the way that people changed the way they thought about rights and about—
That's correct.
About equality.
Which was the influence of Locke and Rousseau, and there were dozens of lesser philosophers. And then like I said, Jefferson and Adams and Paine and John Jay. I mean, there were several major thinkers back in that day who took those ideas and took them a step farther.
Well, let me just go another place. And what I love about you is you are an incredible historian, putting together all the pieces in amazing ways. And so the key ingredient in the Calvinist idea, which I think plays such an important role in who we are now, and certainly among conservatives, and probably also among liberals, is this idea that wealth is the way you judge success.
Right.
Now, Fareed Zakaria just had a piece on Bhutan, which is the country that measures success in terms of happiness. So right. What about the history of measures of success?
In what context?
In terms of judging how to pick leaders, in terms of judging what makes for a successful country.
Oh, I got it. Okay. Yeah, back in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt laid this out quite clearly. In fact, actually, it was 1944, as I recall, when he proposed his second Bill of Rights. But he had given numerous speeches, from his 1933 inaugural address in March of 1933 to his acceptance. The two biggest speeches of his that are worth reading, in addition to his when he rolled out the second Bill of Rights, are his inaugural address in 33 and his 1936 acceptance speech in August of 1936 in Madison Square Garden, as I recall. Maybe it was Philadelphia. No, it was in Philadelphia. And basically what he said was, we have been all about freedom in the United States for 150 years at that point. However, our measurement of freedom has had to do with the restraint of government. We have been free from government interference in our lives. And that was the big concern of the founding generation, was that they didn't want to create a government that simply repeated the mistakes of England. They didn't want to create another oligarchy. And although you could argue that, just having white men voting, but set that aside for a minute, because, the ideals that they were holding to were different than many of the practices they were engaged in, but it was still a revolutionary moment. But anyhow, FDR said, we fought a revolution against political tyranny and economic tyranny. And now we are facing economic tyranny again in our country. And he talked about these economic royalists. He said, they say that we seek to destroy the institutions of America. What they really complain about is that we seek to take away their power. And our loyalty to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. So what he said was, you're not free if you're hungry. You know, we used to define freedom as freedom from government interference. Now we need to redefine freedom. This is 1944. You're not free if you're hungry. His favorite phrase, he quoted this old English judge, he did it in his 32 address too. A necessitous man is not a free man. You're not free if you're hungry. You're not free if you're sick and you have no means to get yourself well. You're not free if you're homeless and you don't have housing. You're not free if you're capable of advancing through society because of your intellect or your other abilities, but the ability to do that is closed off to you. You can't get an education. You're not free if you can't find a job because the periodic cycles of capitalism have failed. And so he proposed that government should establish as rights. And then out of that, of course, government programs to meet those rights, healthcare, education, a job, food and housing, just basic stuff that has been recognized now since World War II in virtually every developed country in the world as rights. And then you've got, gross national happiness in addition to gross national productivity.
And what you point out in the book is we don't have it here.
That's correct. We're the only nation in the developed world that has chosen to keep all those things as privileges rather than rights.
Now, we need to take a brief break. And then when we come back, I'd like you to talk about the stages that we go through to become oligarchies. So we need to take a 25-second break so I can throw in the bumpers for the radio show.
Okay.
My guest for this show is Thom Hartmann. He's a progressive national and internationally syndicated talk show host. He's described by Talkers Magazine as America's most important progressive radio host. And he's got a new book out, The Hidden History of Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. And Thom is one of the most holistic historical thinkers I've ever encountered. And he's bringing that to this picture of what oligarchy is. And what you're going to talk about now is the steps that a nation goes through to become oligarchic. Go.
Okay. Well, typically what happens as a democracy slides into oligarchy is that the oligarchs reach out to seize control of the political process, and they do this using money. The rules of the game have to be changed to allow oligarchs to own politicians. The Supreme Court did that in 76 and 78. And then they doubled down on it with Citizens United in 2010, which was basically just restating what they had done in 76 and 78. And the oligarchs seize control of the media, and the oligarchs seize control of the courts. There are a few other areas where the oligarchs also try to seize control. But basically, once you've got the courts and the legislative branch, it's easy enough to get the executive branch. So you're seizing control of government. And once you have the media in a country that continues to think of itself as a democracy, using that media, you can promote pro-oligarchy messages, even in a profoundly dishonest way, as we're seeing right now and have been seeing for years with right-wing media. Literally lying to their people year after year after year. I mean, we just saw it last week in Texas, where the governor of the state comes out and says, "Oh, it was the windmills and the Green New Deal is what's destroying Texas." There is no Green New Deal yet. It's not even a piece of legislation. It's an idea that AOC proposed, a great idea, but it's not. She didn't sneak into Texas in the middle of the night 15 years ago and change everything to wind power.
Well, I was thinking of Texas when you were talking about how one of the responsibilities of government is to, one of the signs of oligarchy is when they stop caring about the people. And
right.
That's really what happened in Texas. That's really the reason why Texans have gone through what they've gone through in the last week.
Yeah, and you've got, one of Texas's more formidable billionaires who owns the Dallas Rangers or the Dallas Cowboys. His CFO is bragging. He also owns an energy company in Texas, and people are now literally getting $16,000 and $17,000 electric bills for the last month of their electricity, because Texas has a market-based electric system. And so the price of electricity went from 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour to $8,000 a kilowatt hour, hundreds of dollars a kilowatt hour, thousands of dollars, over the course of a few days. And Texans are hopefully realizing
that's deregulation. That's deregulation at work.
Yeah.
Which is certainly something that does not protect individuals. It's just designed for corporations.
Yes. Well, as Warren Harding in 1920, when he ran for president to try to take back the country from the progressives, you'd had 2 progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and then a Democratic president who was, kind of so-so, but his big challenge was World War I, and Woodrow Wilson, his big challenge was World War I and the flu pandemic. And so in 1920, when Woodrow Wilson was running for president, he was running under the slogan of less government and business, more business and government. Now, less government and business is a fancy way of saying deregulate. More business and government is a fancy way of saying privatize. And he did that. He also, his main campaign theme was, quote, a return to normalcy. And by that, he meant dropping the top tax rate from the 90% Woodrow Wilson had set it at down to 25%, which he did. And that kicked off the roaring 20s, the deregulation, the privatization kicked off the roaring 20s, where average working people saw their wages go down substantially over a 10-year period. And the oligarchs got richer and richer and richer. And that brought us right to 1929 and the great stock market crash, which opened the space for FDR.
You talk about the top marginal tax rate. That's the 90% you just referred to. I think it was even a little bit higher under Eisenhower. You say that
yeah, we should call it a tax bracket rather than a rate, but yeah.
Okay. That you say is, if it's lower, people do worse. If it's lower for the oligarchs, for the extremely wealthy, the rest of the people do worse. Why is that?
Well, because to a certain extent, economics is a zero-sum game. I mean, there's only a certain amount of cash circulating in a society. Yes, that amount of cash can be expanded or contracted. It happens both as a function of government policy and the state of the economy. As new things are developed, as technologies grow, the economy grows, and all that sort of thing. But at a certain level, it is a zero-sum game. We had from 1933, the beginning of FDR's election, right up until the beginning of the Reaganomics era, the Reagan Revolution in 1981, which we're still living in, by the way. But during that period of time, that 50-year period of time, from 1930 to 1980, basically, what we saw was a middle class that was growing faster than any middle class had ever grown in the history of the world. They were growing faster in terms of wealth and in terms of income. They were growing faster than even the top 5% or the top 1%. And the result of that was, well, that brings us back to Russell Kirk. And if I can rant for 2 or 3 minutes on this, Rob, about the modern conservative movement and how it led to oligarchy. May I?
No.
Apparently, okay. So in 1951, Russell Kirk wrote this book called The Conservative Mind. And in this book, he starts out with Edmund Burke, who Thomas Paine visited Edmund Burke on his way to get arrested in the French Revolution, and stayed 2 weeks in Burke's castle, his estate, his mansion in the UK. He was a famous British conservative politician. And he and Burke got into such heated arguments about the nature of liberty and the nature of government that Thomas Paine wrote an entire book rebutting Kirk. It's called The Rights of Man. It's still a bestseller. And but Burke's idea and Kirk's reinvention of Burke's idea, and like I said, the first chapter of The Conservative Mind is devoted to Burke. Burke, who famously said, "It does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as that of hairdresser or candlemaker, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to participate in the political dialogue." In other words, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to run for political office. So Kirk was saying in 1951 in this book that the middle class in America at that point in time for the last 15, 20 years had been growing at an unprecedented rate. We were seeing the largest and fastest growing middle class in the history of the world, a brand new phenomenon. There had never before been a country where more than half the population of the country were what you would call middle class. Never had happened before. And Kirk said, this is a rapid change and it's going to produce chaos. It's going to produce a society in crisis if we don't slow this down or stop it. And he predicted in 51 that if the middle class would get wealthier and wealthier, and then they would hit a tipping point. Now, I remember growing up in the 1950s, my dad bought a house in a brand new subdivision in South Lansing for $13,000. I was surrounded, my neighbor, the guy behind me was a dentist. Most of the people around us who lived around us were working at Oldsmobile or GM. Back then, dentists made the same as guys working on the assembly line at GM. I knew a number of families just on my block, 3 families on my block that had small vacation homes up on Houghton Lake or up in northern Michigan. It was relatively inexpensive up there, but everybody was living this solid middle class life. This was 1956 that I remember, when I was a little kid. So Kirk said, when that critical tipping point, if this middle class keeps getting richer and richer and richer so that they can have 2 weeks of vacation every year, and they can have a pension when they retire, and they can pay their house off in 30 or 40 years, and they can have a second home. If we reach this critical mass where the middle class has so much economic power that they are no longer afraid, which is back to Hobbes, you have to have this Leviathan, this iron fist of church or state. If we hit the point where they're no longer afraid, then what's going to happen is among the middle class, you're going to see young people no longer respecting their elders. You're going to see women no longer knowing their place in society. You're going to see minorities no longer accepting the class structure and racial structure of our society. And the result of that is going to be absolute chaos in those 3 dimensions of American life. And there were a couple of others that he mentioned as well, but those were the big ones. And so in the 50s, Kirk's book was a minor sensation in 51 and 53 when it was published, and it's gone through 3 rewrites, and the last one I think was in 68, and then I think Kirk died. But in the 50s, it caught William F. Buckley on fire. It lit up Barry Goldwater. He was just totally down with Russell Kirk. I mean, the intelligentsia of the right was fascinated by Russell Kirk, but the rest of the Republican Party and the right thought him a crank. They thought he was just a crackpot, warning about societal disintegration if the middle class gets too wealthy. And then came the 1960s. And in 61, the birth control pill was legalized. And so by 63 and in 64, in the Connecticut v. Loving case, I believe it was, it used to be it was illegal even for a marriage. No, the Loving case was interracial marriage. This was, I want to say Cunningham, it's a name somewhat like that. But in any case, there was a Supreme Court case where a married couple could go to prison for having a condom in their bedroom. The state of Connecticut had outlawed birth control in response to pressure from the Catholic Church. And the Supreme Court knocked that down. And so that was in 64, as I recall. And by 65, you had the Vietnam War going, you had LSD and pot starting to make their way into the teenage society. You had a women's movement that was now well established and had leadership, and women were literally burning their bras, and you had this free sex revolution going on. But more importantly, women were demanding equality in the workplace because they could now control their reproductive cycles the same as men could. And you had an African-American liberation movement essentially being led, in one dimension being led by Martin Luther King, and others being led by people like Stokely Carmichael and SNCC and the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. But basically, you had this Black liberation movement with this whole spectrum that was really, really having success. And so by the late 60s, by 67, 68, 69, you had American cities on fire, Black people out in the streets, women demanding equal rights in the workplace and charging men with sexual harassment and things like that. Young people burning their draft cards, young men burning their draft cards, and young men and women openly defying campus authorities. And at that point, the conservative intelligentsia, and basically the entire Republican Party, and a good chunk of the Democratic Party, looked back and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was right. And we've got to do something about this. I shouldn't say a good chunk of the Democratic Party, because the Democrats never really bought that, outside of the young people in the war. But this was what Richard Nixon went to in 72, was, Russell Kirk was right, and we need to control this. We need to get, we need to have law and order. We need to restore people to their place in society. His whole Southern strategy was about putting Black people back in their place. His silent majority was all about putting kids and women back in their place. It was basically the silent majority of white men. And so when Reagan came into office in 1980, his mandate was to follow Kirk's advice and stop the growth of the middle class, because it was in the mind of many of these conservative thinkers, and I think frankly in Reagan's mind, this threatened to destabilize America. The women's movement, the Black movement, the young persons movement, all of these things collectively, and they had lowered the voting age to 18 at that point, which was a total freak out for conservatives. And at that point, they really believed that America would continue to disintegrate. The weather underground would become like Mao Zedong and eventually take over the country, and all this kind of stuff. And so the mandate that Reagan had in 1980 from his party and from the thinkers in his party was to gut the middle class, to get rid of these pesky unions that guarantee people, the same income that a dentist is making, and to get rid of all the constraints that had been put on corporations, on private corporations building wealth, like pollution restraints and things like that, to basically deregulate and down-regulate the middle class and upregulate the Leviathan, the upper class, who could then restore stability to America and move us forward.
So this explains really why there's such a strong tie between conservatism and oligarchy.
Yes. Well, they're essentially the same thing. Conservatism is the economic, political, and philosophical rationale for oligarchy.
Okay, so you talk about how there's a crisis, and we're both into story. You got me into story big time when you sent me one of your early novels. And by the way, do you have novels that have been published?
I do. They're not any good. I wouldn't recommend anybody bother to buy them.
Wait. What about The Secret one? That's a good one.
It was okay, but it was, for its time. I mean, that was Neil Donald Walsh asked me to write that book for his new imprint, and Louise and I wrote that book in about 2 weeks. It's what I've learned is that fiction is an art form that requires an extraordinary discipline and talent, and that I did not make the investment in learning how to do well. I made the same mistake that people make, thinking that they can do. I mean, most of us look at a Rembrandt and think, my God, I could never do that. But people listen to Rush Limbaugh and say, oh, I could easily do that. Just give me a microphone. Or people read a novel by a really good novelist and say, oh, I can do that. I could bang out a novel, and which was me. I was thinking that. But after you've done it, and then you reread your own work and compare it to the work of really brilliant novelists, people like Ace Atkins or Robert V. Parker or John D. MacDonald or whatever, and you get it that writing fiction is, I'm really good at writing nonfiction. Because I've been doing it my whole entire life. I started in news when I was a teenager, writing news. I can write nonfiction with the best of them, but my fiction sucks.
But you did do a lot of study of the art of story. And in your book, you refer to how we're going through the crisis that can turn a nation to oligarchy has some similarity to what happens in story. And I was hoping you could get into that and describe that.
Well, I think the story that was told, and you certainly get this when you read Thomas Paine's initial major pamphlet that helped kick off the American Revolution, Common Sense. The story that was told was that, and that Jefferson writes about at some length in his private diaries, which are now in print, or have been since 1909 actually, was that when you observe the Iroquois Confederacy, for example, which Jefferson and Franklin were very into, and Paine as well. When you observe other peoples around the world, you get that people can live in peace, people can live in harmony, you can have a society that works for everybody. It's going to take a while to get there, but we can do this. We can proclaim that this is our goal, this is our mission. And I think they did that very effectively back in that day. And the question now is whether, is to what extent we can write a new story. The story that I'm seeing right now, Rob, and frankly that I'm writing in my daily posts over on thomhartmann.medium.com, that story is about how the oligarchs are, holding. They have achieved power with the Reagan Revolution, and they're doing everything they can to hold on to that power. And so it's kind of an anti-story. It's we have to defeat the king, as it were, or the kings and lords. And I think that the vision that FDR laid out in his second Bill of Rights speech is not widely enough recognized by Americans, and particularly by the Democratic Party, because it was he was to the left of Bernie Sanders. Or he was right there with Bernie Sanders. Bernie has called for all of the things in FDR's second Bill of Rights, actually. And so, we need to be telling those stories too. We need to be, and occasionally you hear this, and Bernie's very good at this, the minimum wage debate, the price of burgers is going to go up. Well, in Denmark, the minimum wage is $18 an hour, and the price of burgers are just fine. Thank you very much, when compared to anything else in society. So the story that we need going forward is that the oligarchy is dysfunctional. The American oligarchy itself is dysfunctional. The laissez-faire ideology behind it brings you things like Texas in the ice storm, and it needs to change. It's killing people. And in particular, what needs to change, and change rapidly, is the racial piece of that, the racist piece of that, because we're throwing away, and the gender and the misogynist piece of that, because we're in the fight against women's rights that was led so effectively by Rush Limbaugh for so many years. You're throwing away the talent of half the American population. And in the rights for minorities, which are a little more than a third of the American population, you're throwing away a lot of talent there too. And so if we're going to rebuild this country, we need all hands on deck. We need everybody to be aboard. We need everybody to have the kind of educational opportunities and economic opportunities that up until this point have been largely reserved to white men.
There's now a common thing where people refer to how they want to be referred, he, she, what have you. And when it comes to story, what I really believe is that right now, almost all the stories that are told, all the movies, most of the novels, they're all about a hero's journey. And there's a hero, some woman or guy who saves everybody else. And the story that needs to change is that it needs to be we, not he or she. It's got to be all of us coming together to change it. And we need to see stories like that.
Yeah, that was Bernie's slogan, remember? We, not me.
That's right, yeah. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and we're going to take another brief break, and then I want to talk about billionaires, because you and I have been having conversations and writing about that for longer than almost anybody. And I think we need to, because that's what the oligarchs are anyway. So we'll take a brief show ID and then come back and talk about that, okay?
Sure.
My guest for the show is Thom Hartmann, a progressive national and internationally syndicated talk show host, described by Talkers Magazine as America's most important progressive host and one of the top 10 radio shows in the country every year for over a decade. He's got a new book out, The Hidden History of Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class, and his website is thomhartmann.com. So, billionaires, I was just, the funding behind the Capitol insurrection, a lot of it came from the Mercers, one of the big billionaire right-wing families. Where do billionaires fit into the oligarchy?
Well, oligarchs by definition are rich people or the agents of rich people. And we have probably a couple dozen right-wing billionaires in the United States who have used hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars of their wealth to subsidize right-wing politicians, basically neo-fascism. I mean, I view Trumpism as American fascism, and that American fascist movement is still alive and well. In fact, in some regards, it's growing. But I'm not sure that saying that because billionaires are funding fascist political movements, they shouldn't be billionaires. I think that we need to expand the frame beyond that and just ask the question, how does it benefit society for any one individual to lock up access to more than $1 billion in this world? I mean, how does that possibly help society? Nick Hanauer, the guy who started the Patriotic Millionaires, or one of the guys who started it, was on my show a while ago. I think you probably had him on too, Rob. And he said, you and I are both men. We both wear jeans. You probably have 2 or 3 pairs of jeans, or 4 or 5. He said, so do I. I can't buy. He says, I make 10,000 times what you make every year, but I can't buy 10,000 pairs of blue jeans. So how is it that giving money to me is economic stimulus when I'm not going to spend it? I'm just going to put it someplace, park it someplace. But giving money to you, who is going to spend it, is a bad policy. And so, I have this website, nobillionaires.com, and I haven't done much with it in probably 5 years, but it's there. And I've written a number of pieces about billionaires representing a threat to us. I would propose that we have a wealth tax that is graduated, a progressive wealth tax. Elizabeth Warren is proposing 2% on all assets over several $100 million. I would raise that to 100% above $1 billion and just say, if you've got $1 billion in your money bin, money that is liquid that you have access to, then that's enough for you. And that's enough for your children and their grandchildren and their children and their children and their children. That's dynastic money.
And I use that word exactly. I think we should have a dynasty tax. I just wrote a piece about it.
Right.
I think the piece missing from this relief bill that Biden has put together for $1.9 trillion is, how do you pay for it? And it blows my mind that's not in there. And the answer is what you just described: a serious tax on the ultra wealthy. Ultra wealthy is people over $35 million. And yep. I think we should be having a big conversation right now that the way to pay for that 1.9 trillion is to put taxes on the 1%. And why isn't that happening? I don't understand.
Well, it's because the 1% own 100% of the Republican Party. All the senators in the Senate, even the most outspoken anti-Trump senator, Mitt Romney, is himself a billionaire. So that's, the Republican Party. And in the Democratic Party, in the Senate in particular, at least half of the United States Senate Democrats are controlled or are owned or are largely in debt to billionaires or the industries that create billionaires.
But this is an opportunity, this $1.9 trillion bill that's being passed with the 51%, it's an opportunity for us to put the pressure on. I'm with you. And I think that a wealth tax is a great idea. I think that's not as likely to happen as rolling back Donald Trump's $1.5 trillion tax cut. That if we were to simply reverse everything in that, except the impact on people below $400,000 a year, which is what Biden campaigned on, that would generate at least $1 trillion to pay for this bill, as it were. Yeah, but is that being discussed? I haven't seen that conversation. That's a separate item, right? It
was discussed during the campaign. I haven't seen it, but there hasn't been much discussion about this $1.9 trillion bill because it hasn't. I mean, it's just going to be released next week in the House, and so we haven't had a chance to look at it yet. It's 600 pages long, and second, that's not a policy debate that the billionaires who own our media and the multimillionaires who star in our news media, and you can take it to the bank. If you see somebody on television, regardless of the network, that person is worth multiple millions of dollars as a result of being in that position. And they're not interested in having a conversation about raising taxes on themselves.
Yeah, but I think we need to be doing that.
Yeah, we do. You and I both do that, Rob. We've been doing it for what have we known each other, 30 years, something like that?
Yeah.
We've been talking about this stuff.
I think that, but the people on the left are not doing that right now, and now seems to be the ideal time to do that.
I agree. So let's keep the conversation going. Let's push that out as often as possible.
You wrap. I really haven't covered much in the book on how there are solutions, and I haven't barely touched on where you get into the history of oligarchy. You talk about it in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and the Depression and Reagan era. So you've covered some of that, but there's an amazing amount of information in there that's really valuable. But the last thing you talk about is what to do about it. What are we doing about it?
Well, we need to break up big monopolies, particularly media monopolies, and re-democratize our economy. We need to get money out of politics. HR 1 takes some steps in that direction that are really good. And it's going to be the major fight. I'm getting daily emails now from FreedomWorks calling it the Gag Act and proclaiming that it's going to shut down the ability of billionaires to participate in politics, and therefore it's a terrible, terrible thing.
What's HR 1?
Yeah. Oh yeah, go over to FreedomWorks and sign up for their email newsletter. It's fascinating, and you need to know what they're saying. It's remarkable. So you've got
HR 1
that. Say that again.
What is HR 1?
HR 1 is called the For the People Act, and it is voting reform, essentially, electoral reform. And it would establish certain minimum standards across the country for how states can run elections. It restates the Motor Voter Act's assertion from 1993, I think it was, maybe it was 97, that voting is a right in the United States and may not be deprived. People may not be deprived of that right, except under extraordinary circumstances. It would make it much more difficult for secretaries of state, like they do in purple states and red states, regularly to purge voting rolls. It would ban 10-hour lines to vote. There's all these ways that Republicans rig the vote basically in advance, or rig the process to vote. And it would solve a lot of that. And it would, again, begin the process of regulating money in politics. It will face it, if it passes, it's going to face a challenge at the Supreme Court, and which may provoke a whole nother crisis. But we need to be throwing all our energy right now behind HR 1, because without a functional electoral system, you don't have a functional democratic republic.
All right, and we need to wrap. Final words.
Well, we need to get active, number one. Number two, we need to get Joe Manchin to back off his opposition to ending the filibuster. If the dangerous thing about the instability of oligarchy and their tendency to flip into authoritarianism and fascism is that people become cynical when government doesn't work for them. And that's what the Republicans are counting on. They are going to do everything they can, just like they did during Obama's 8 years. They're going to do everything they can to block Biden's agenda. And ending the filibuster has to be job one, so that the Obama administration can have some successes, so that the American people can once again have confidence that their government actually works for them. So contact Joe Manchin and tell him to end the filibuster. All
right, and we've got a wrap. My guest for the show has been Thom Hartmann. He's the author of a new book, among dozens of books, The Hidden History of Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. His website is thomhartmann.com. Thanks so much, Thom. It's been great.
Thanks, Ron. It's always great being with you.
All right, recording is over. So.
Still says recording on mine.
Oh, wait. I hit stop. All right. I'll talk to you later, because that'll turn it off for sure.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Rob. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.